This happened 2 summers ago during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend camping trip with my best friend Jake. We're both 26, experienced hikers, and we'd been planning this trip to Blackwood National Forest for months. We wanted to get as far away from civilization as possible. No cell service, no other campers, just us and the wilderness. We hiked about 8 miles into the backcountry before finding the perfect spot, a small clearing next to a stream, surrounded by thick pine trees. It felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. We set up our tents about 10 feet apart, built a fire ring, and spent the afternoon fishing and relaxing. As the sun started setting, we cooked our catch over the fire and talked about how perfect the trip was going. No crowds, no noise, just the sounds of nature. Jake even joked that we might be the only people for miles around. That's when we should have paid more attention to how quiet it actually was. Around 9 p.m., as we were getting ready to turn in for the night, Jake pointed something out that made us both uneasy. The normal forest sounds, crickets, birds, small animals moving through the underbrush, had completely stopped. The silence was so complete, it felt oppressive. Maybe there's a predator nearby, Jake suggested. Bears or mountain lions can make everything else go quiet. We decided to be extra careful with our food storage and keep the fire going a bit longer. But after an hour of sitting in that unnatural silence, we were both getting spooked. We doused the fire and retreated to our tents. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps moving around our campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that circled our tents in a wide arc. At first, I assumed it was Jake getting up to use the bathroom, but then I heard him snoring softly in his tent. The footsteps continued their circuit around our campsite. They'd start from one side, move slowly around the perimeter, and complete a full circle before starting again. The pattern was too deliberate to be an animal randomly exploring. I unzipped my tent flap quietly and peered out. The moon was bright enough to see clearly, but I couldn't make out any movement in the tree line. Yet I could still hear the footsteps now seeming to come from multiple directions. "Jake," I whispered loudly. "Jake, wake up." His snoring stopped. "What's wrong?" "Someone's walking around our camp." "Listen." We both stayed perfectly still, and sure enough, the footsteps continued. But now they seemed closer, just outside the ring of trees surrounding our clearing. "Should we check it out?" Jake asked. Before I could answer, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence returned to the forest. We waited for several minutes, but whatever had been circling us was gone. "Probably just a curious deer or something," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. I tried to go back to sleep, but every little sound made me alert. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps returned. This time, they were definitely closer. I could hear them moving through our actual campsite rather than staying in the tree line. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully unzipped my tent. What I saw in the beam of light made my blood run cold. Footprints. Human footprints in the soft dirt around our campsite. But they weren't normal. Each print showed 5 toes, but there was something wrong with them. They were too long, too pointed, and there seemed to be an extra toe or claw extending from each foot. The prints formed a perfect circle around both of our tents, probably 30 feet in diameter. Whoever or whatever had made them had been walking around us for hours, getting closer with each circuit. "Jake," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to see this." He emerged from his tent with his own flashlight, and I showed him the prints. In the twin beams of our lights, they looked even more disturbing. The impressions were deep, suggesting whatever made them was heavy, and the spacing between steps indicated something much taller than a normal person. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered. That's when we heard breathing. Heavy, rhythmic breathing, coming from the darkness just beyond our lights. It sounded human, but wrong somehow, like someone with a severe respiratory problem trying to catch their breath. We stood back to back in the center of our campsite, flashlights sweeping the tree line. But we couldn't locate the source of the breathing. It seemed to move around us, sometimes coming from one direction, then shifting to another. "We need to get out of here." "It's the middle of the night. We're 8 miles from the trailhead. We'll never make it in the dark." The breathing suddenly stopped, and we heard something that made us both freeze. the sound of our tent zippers being slowly opened. We spun around to see both of our tents being entered by something we couldn't clearly see. Dark shapes, human-sized but moving wrong, like their joints bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. "Run," Jake said. We dropped our flashlights and ran into the forest, abandoning everything we'd brought. Behind us, we could hear sounds of destruction, our tents being torn apart, our gear being scattered around the campsite. We stumbled through the darkness for what felt like hours, following what we hoped was the general direction of the trail. Branches tore at our clothes and faces, but we didn't dare stop or turn on any lights. Just before dawn, we finally reached the main trail and made it back to our car. We drove straight to the park ranger station and reported what had happened. The ranger who took our statement listened patiently, but I could tell he was skeptical. When we described the footprints and the strange breathing sounds, his expression became more serious. "How many toes did you say the prints had?" he asked. "More than 5. Maybe 6 or 7 on each foot." The ranger was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out a file folder and showed us photographs of similar prints that had been found at other campsites in the area over the past few years. "We've had reports," he said carefully, "always from backcountry campers. Always the same description. Extra toes, circling behavior, tents being destroyed after people flee." "What do you think it is?" "Honestly, I don't know, but we've started recommending that people avoid camping alone in the deep woods. Whatever's out there, it seems to be getting bolder." We never went back to retrieve our gear. The ranger offered to send a team to collect what was left, but when they reached our campsite 2 days later, they found nothing. Our tents, sleeping bags, backpacks, everything had vanished completely. The only trace that we'd ever been there were the footprints, dozens of them, covering the entire clearing. But according to the ranger's report, these prints were different from the ones we'd seen. They showed normal human feet, size 10 and 11, exactly matching our boot sizes, as if whatever had been stalking us had somehow taken on our appearance after we left. I still go camping, but never in remote areas, and never without cell service, because I know there's something in those deep woods that walks like a human, but isn't one. Something that studies you, circles you, and waits for you to run. I thought I'd found the perfect hidden camping spot until I realized why it was so perfectly cleared and maintained. My name is Ryan, and I'm what you'd call a serious backpacker. I've been exploring remote wilderness areas for over 10 years, always looking for places that most people never see. I pride myself on finding spots that aren't on any trail maps, places where you can camp for days without seeing another soul. Last fall, I was exploring a section of national forest that I'd never been to before. It's one of those areas that looks empty on the map. No marked trails, no designated camping areas, just wilderness. Exactly the kind of challenge I love. I hiked cross-country for about 6 hours, using a compass and GPS to navigate through thick forest and steep terrain. Just as I was starting to think about setting up camp for the night, I stumbled upon something incredible. Hidden in a natural bowl between 3 hills was the most perfect camping spot I'd ever seen. It was a circular clearing about 50 feet across, surrounded by towering pine trees. The ground was level and covered with soft grass. There was a small spring feeding a clear stream, and there was even a natural fire ring made of stones. But here's what made it really special. It looked maintained. The grass was evenly trimmed, the fire ring was perfectly constructed, and there were even logs arranged around it like benches. Someone had put a lot of work into making this place perfect. My first thought was that I'd discovered some kind of unofficial camping spot used by other serious backpackers, a secret place that experienced hikers had developed over the years and kept off the official maps. I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing and spent the evening enjoying what felt like a personal camping paradise. The spring water was crystal clear, the fire burned perfectly in the stone ring, and the clearing was positioned so that you could see stars through the opening in the forest canopy. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something odd. Around the entire perimeter of the clearing, about 10 feet into the tree line, there was a ring of small cairns, carefully stacked stones about 2 feet high. They were evenly spaced, maybe 20 feet apart, forming a perfect circle around the clearing. I had seen trail markers before, but these didn't mark any trail. They seemed to be marking the boundary of the clearing itself, like some kind of perimeter. I figured they were probably left by whoever had developed this camping spot, maybe to mark the official campsite area. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The clearing was so peaceful, so perfectly designed for camping, that it felt like sleeping in a luxury hotel room made of nature. I woke up the next morning feeling completely refreshed. But as I was making breakfast, I noticed something that made me pause. My campfire had been rekindled. I was certain I'd put it out completely before going to bed. I'm always careful about fire safety in the wilderness. But there was a small fire burning in the ring, with fresh logs that definitely weren't there the night before. I looked around the clearing, wondering if another camper had arrived during the night, but I saw no other tents or gear, just my stuff and the mysteriously renewed campfire. I decided to explore the area around the clearing to see if I could find any signs of whoever was maintaining this place. Following the stream uphill, I found more evidence of human activity: carefully placed stepping stones across the creek, fallen trees that had been cut and moved to create natural bridges, even a small lean-to shelter built against a large rock. But everything looked old, like it had been built years ago and carefully maintained ever since. And I still hadn't seen any sign of who was doing the maintaining. That afternoon, I decided to hike to a nearby ridge to get a better view of the area. From up high, I could see the clearing perfectly, and what I saw from that perspective made me deeply uncomfortable. The clearing wasn't just a natural opening in the forest. From above, it was clearly artificial, a perfect circle cut out of the wilderness. The cairns around the perimeter were visible from the ridge, and they formed such a precise geometric pattern that it looked ritualistic. But what really disturbed me was seeing how isolated the clearing actually was. I was at least 10 miles from the nearest marked trail, in terrain so difficult that it would take an expert navigator to find this place. Yet someone had not only found it, but had spent enormous effort developing it into a perfect camping facility. I started wondering what kind of person would put that much work into a place so remote that almost no one would ever see it. As evening approached, I decided to pack up and leave first thing in the morning. Something about the clearing was starting to feel wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing in someone's very private space. But that night, I discovered I wasn't alone. Around 11 p.m., I was lying in my tent reading when I heard voices outside. Not close to my tent, but somewhere around the edge of the clearing. Multiple people talking in low tones, like they were trying not to wake me. I quietly unzipped my tent flap and peered out. I could see lights moving through the trees, flashlights or lanterns being carried by people walking around the perimeter of the clearing. The lights stayed in the tree line, never entering the clearing itself, but they slowly circled the entire area. I counted at least 4 separate lights, which meant at least 4 people. They moved in a coordinated pattern, always staying the same distance apart, like they were conducting some kind of patrol or ceremony. The voices were too quiet to make out words, but the tone sounded serious, almost formal, like people reciting something or following a script. This went on for about an hour. The lights would complete a circuit around the clearing, stop for a few minutes, then start again. Always the same pattern, always staying just outside the boundary marked by the cairns. Around midnight, the lights gathered at one spot on the edge of the clearing and stayed there. I could hear the voices more clearly now. They were definitely speaking in unison, like a group recitation or chant, but I couldn't understand the language they were using. Then, abruptly, everything went silent. The lights disappeared, the voices stopped, and the forest returned to normal nighttime sounds. I barely slept the rest of the night, listening for any sign that the people might return. But the clearing remained quiet until dawn. In the morning, I packed up as quickly as possible and left. But as I was heading out, I checked the perimeter where I'd seen the lights gathering. There, pressed into the soft earth, were dozens of footprints. Human footprints, but they were arranged in a perfect circle around one of the cairns. Like a group of people had stood hand in hand around the stone marker, and in the center of the circle, someone had left an offering, a small pile of wild flowers and what looked like handmade bread. I followed my GPS coordinates back to the main trail as fast as I could hike. When I reached my car, I drove straight to the nearest town and stopped at a diner to process what I'd experienced. When I told the waitress about the hidden clearing, her expression immediately changed. "You need to stay away from that place," she said seriously. "The local tribes consider it sacred ground. People aren't supposed to camp there, but someone's been maintaining it like a campsite." "That's not maintenance," she said. "That's ceremony. There are groups that still use the old places for rituals. They've been doing it for generations, long before this area became a national forest." She explained that the clearing was a traditional gathering place used for seasonal ceremonies by descendants of the area's original inhabitants. The perfect camping setup wasn't designed for modern backpackers. It was a ceremonial site that had been maintained for spiritual purposes for decades. "The people you heard weren't trying to hurt you," she continued, "but they probably weren't happy about finding a stranger in their sacred space. You're lucky they let you leave peacefully." I never went back to that clearing, and I've never tried to find another hidden camping spot, because I learned that sometimes the most perfect places in the wilderness are perfect for reasons you don't understand, and you might not be the first person to discover them. The campground host told us we were the only guests that weekend. So who was singing around the campfire in Site 23? I'm Alex, 29 years old, and I've always loved camping with my brother Mike. We try to get out into nature at least once a month, usually to established campgrounds where we can relax without worrying about navigation or survival skills. We're not hardcore wilderness types. We like having bathrooms, picnic tables, and the security of knowing help is nearby if needed. Last October, we booked a weekend at Pine Ridge Campground, a small state park facility about 3 hours from home. It's one of those older campgrounds, with maybe 20 sites scattered through the woods, each one fairly isolated from the others. We'd been there before and loved how peaceful it was, especially during the off-season, when most sites were empty. When we checked in on Friday afternoon, the campground host confirmed what we'd hoped. We were the only campers that weekend. The weather had been cold and rainy all week, and apparently everyone else had cancelled their reservations. "You boys will have the whole place to yourselves," he said with a smile. "Sites 12 and 13 are ready for you. I'll be in my trailer at the entrance if you need anything, but I usually turn in early. Just remember to keep your food secured. We've had some bear activity lately." We drove to our adjacent campsites and set up our tents. The campground felt different when it was completely empty. Bigger, quieter, almost eerie in how deserted it was. But we were looking forward to having the trails, fire rings, and facilities all to ourselves. Friday night was perfect. We built a fire, cooked dinner, and spent hours talking and drinking beer under a clear sky full of stars. The only sounds were the crackling fire and distant forest noises. It felt like we had our own private camping resort. Saturday was equally peaceful. We hiked the trail system, fished in the small lake, and generally enjoyed the rare experience of having an entire campground to ourselves. As evening approached, we were already planning to come back during the next off-season weekend. But Saturday night, things started feeling wrong. We were sitting around our campfire around 9 p.m. when we heard something that made us both stop talking and listen carefully. From somewhere deeper in the campground came the faint sound of singing. It was definitely human voices, multiple people singing together in harmony. The melody was clear enough to recognize as some kind of folk song or traditional tune, but we couldn't make out the words from our distance. "I thought we were the only ones here," Mike said. "That's what the host told us. Maybe someone arrived after dark." We listened for a few more minutes. The singing continued, sometimes getting a bit louder, sometimes fading to barely audible. It sounded like a group of people sitting around their own campfire, enjoying an evening of music. "Should we go introduce ourselves?" Mike suggested. I was curious too, but something about the situation felt off. If other campers had arrived, wouldn't we have heard their cars driving past our sites? Wouldn't we have seen their headlights? Our sites were near the campground entrance, and anyone coming in after dark would have had to pass close to us. We decided to take a walk and see who our unexpected neighbors were. Following the campground road, we walked toward the area where the singing seemed to be coming from, the loop of sites at the far end of the campground. As we got closer, the singing became clearer. It was definitely a group of people. I could distinguish at least 4 or 5 different voices singing in harmony. The song sounded old-fashioned, like something from the early 1900s, with complex harmonies that suggested the singers were experienced. But when we reached the area where the singing was loudest, we couldn't see anything. We were standing near Site 23, where the sound seemed to be coming from, but the campsite was completely dark and empty. No tent, no car, no campfire, no people, just an empty picnic table and a cold fire ring. Yet we could still hear the singing clear as day coming from exactly where we were standing. "This is impossible," Mike whispered. We walked around the entire campsite, checking behind trees and looking for any sign of campers. Nothing. The site was completely unoccupied, but the singing continued, as if there was an invisible group sitting around an invisible campfire. "Maybe it's echoing from another site," I suggested. We checked every campsite in that section of the campground. All empty, all dark, all obviously unoccupied. But no matter where we walked, the singing seemed to be coming from Site 23. After about 20 minutes of searching, the singing gradually faded away and stopped. We stood in the darkness, thoroughly spooked, wondering what we'd just experienced. "Sound can play tricks in the woods," Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. Maybe it was carrying from somewhere far away. We walked back to our sites, but neither of us felt like sitting around the campfire anymore. We went to bed early, but I spent most of the night lying awake, listening for any other unexplained sounds. Sunday morning, we packed up and went to check out with the campground host. I decided to casually ask him about Site 23. "Oh, you heard them too?" he said matter-of-factly. "Heard who?" "The singers. Site 23 gets a lot of activity, especially on quiet weekends when there aren't many other campers around." Mike and I looked at each other. "What kind of activity?" The host sighed and sat down, like he was preparing to tell a story he'd told many times before. "This campground was built on land that used to be a summer camp for kids back in the 1940s and 50s. Site 23 is right where they used to have their evening campfires. Every night, the kids would gather there to sing songs before bedtime." He paused, looking slightly uncomfortable. "The camp closed in 1957 after a tragedy. A group of kids and their counselor were killed in a bus accident while coming back from a day trip. 7 children and 1 adult, all between the ages of 8 and 16. And people hear them singing? Not all the time, but when the campground is mostly empty, especially during cool weather like this weekend, people report hearing children's voices singing around Site 23, always the same kind of old camp songs that kids used to sing back then." The host explained that the phenomenon had been reported dozens of times over the years by different campers. Always the same description: multiple voices singing in harmony, always coming from Site 23, never any visible source for the sounds. "The state investigated it a few years ago," he continued. "Brought in audio equipment, researchers, the whole thing. They never found a natural explanation for the sounds. Does it scare people away? Some people, but others come specifically hoping to hear it. The singing is always peaceful, never threatening. It's like the kids are just continuing their evening campfire tradition." Mike asked if there were any other unusual reports from the campground. "Sometimes people see lights moving around Site 23 at night. Sometimes they smell wood smoke when there's no fire. A few people have reported seeing figures sitting around the fire ring, but only out of the corner of their eye. When they look directly, there's nothing there." We thanked the host and left, but the experience stayed with both of us. On the drive home, we talked about what we'd heard and whether we believed the explanation. "Do you think we actually heard dead children singing?" Mike asked. I didn't know how to answer that. What we'd experienced was real. We'd both heard the same thing at the same time, but the idea that it was the ghosts of kids from a 1950s summer camp seemed impossible to accept. A few weeks later, I did some research on the campground's history. Everything the host had told us was true. Pine Ridge Summer Camp had operated from 1943 to 1957, and it had indeed closed after a tragic accident that killed 7 children and their counselor. I found old photographs of the camp, including pictures of evening campfires with groups of kids sitting around singing. The location matched exactly with what is now Campsite 23. I also found newspaper accounts of the accident. The children who died were all members of the camp choir, known for their beautiful harmonies and their knowledge of traditional folk songs. Mike and I have been back to Pine Ridge Campground twice since then. Both times we've heard the singing from Site 23. Both times we've walked over to investigate and found nothing visible. But now, instead of being scared, we sit quietly and listen. The voices are beautiful, innocent, filled with the kind of joy that only children can express. It's like being privileged to hear an echo from a happier time, before tragedy cut their songs short.